Okay, good afternoon. I'm Mabel Berezin, professor of sociology here at Cornell, and I'm also director of the Institute for European Studies, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with our institute is part of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies. I want to welcome you again to our Spring 2022 speaker series, which begins with 3 talks that focus on challenges to democracy, authoritarianism, and extremism in Europe and beyond. Today's talk is the second in that series. 2022 begins our 30th anniversary year here at the Institute for European Studies. In spring 1992, the Berlin Wall had fallen, as had the old Soviet Union. Optimism was in the European political air, and in that exuberant Cornell political moment, Cornell faculty who worked on Eastern Europe and Western Europe, parts of Europe that had been considered radically different, came together to found the Institute for European Studies. And they thought, as did everyone at that moment, that they imagined they would be studying a united and democratic Europe. Today, it is sometimes difficult to remember that optimistic moment. Populism is embedded in the European political landscape, and academic analysts and journalists speak of fascism and authoritarianism with the same fluidity that they spoke of democracy in the past. So it seemed appropriate and timely to begin our 30th anniversary year with 3 lectures focused upon contemporary challenges to European democracy. Now, there are many ways that groups celebrate and commemorate in an educational institution, but one of the major things we do is train students to do research and contribute to the study of Europe. And one of the best measures of our accomplishments are the accomplishments of the students that we've produced who've gone on to make their own significant contributions to the study of Europe. So in the spirit of our 30th anniversary, our 3 initial speakers began their Europe journey here at IES at Cornell as undergraduates or graduate students. And this brings me to our speaker today, Elisabeth Becker. Elisabeth graduated summa cum laude from Cornell in 2006, where she wrote a thesis on ethnic conflict in Kosovo. In the past 16 years, she has developed a career as an academic and a public commentator on, broadly put, although very broadly put, religion and civic life, focusing mainly on issues of European migration and integration. Becker's career has been global, multicultural, and interdisciplinary from its beginning. When she graduated from Cornell, she received a prestigious Truman Fellowship and a Marshall Fellowship that enabled her to study at Oxford and the London School of Economics. In those institutions, she received 2 master's degrees, one in refugees and migration studies, and one in Latin American studies. Before returning to graduate school at Yale, where she received her PhD in 2018, she spent 3 years in Washington, D.C., working with an agency on food policy research, which took her frequently to Latin America. She is currently assistant professor, and no, my German here is not so great. It's not one of my languages, but as I understand it, a Freigeist Fellow, which is a Free Spirit Fellow. I love the idea of a Free Spirit Fellow. It's at the University of Heidelberg and the Max Weber Institute of Sociology. And that Free Spirit Fellowship includes $1.5 million in research funding for interdisciplinary and risk-taking research. And she's certainly ranged widely in her career. Before that, she was an assistant professor at University College Dublin. She has numerous accomplishments. Let me just briefly go through some of them. She is the author of Mosques in the Metropolis, Incivility, Caste and Contention in Europe, University of Chicago Press, 2021. She has a book manuscript in process called The Moving Lives of Jewish Berliners, Her public engagement, she's not just a book person and an academic who sits simply writing, although she does much of that, is extensive and numerous. So I can only give you a flavor of what she's done. In 2018, she was the author of a report, Muslims for American Progress, an impact report of Muslim contributions to New York City. And she presented that work in several important cultural venues in New York City, such as the New York Public Library, the Brooklyn Historical Society, and the Tenement Museum in New York City. She was also a fellow of the New America Foundation when she did that work. She has also a burgeoning journalistic career, and she has had numerous publications. She is a regular contributor to Tablet magazine, where she is a fellow, and she's written many articles on Jewish migration, or former Jewish migration. She has an amazing collection of essays, if I do say so, in the Washington Post, in which she talks about the conflicts, the cultural possibilities and conflicts around her own Muslim and Jewish family. She talks about anti-Semitism, one article, anti-Semitism hit me close to home, so I value Hanukkah all the more this year. That was 2019. And the same year she wrote, What It's Like to See My Husband's Mosque on Fire, all of them in the Washington Post. She has received numerous grants and awards. She has given a keynote address at the Einstein Forum in 2021. And as you can see, she's actively engaged in both the public and academic sphere. You will have a chance to engage with Elisabeth in the question and answering period. But for the moment, I think it's time for us to meet Elisabeth herself. So it was my great pleasure to welcome Elisabeth Becker back to our institute, and of course, back to Cornell. Elisabeth, she will talk to us about impossible pluralism, religious minorities, migrants, and unsettled European democracy. Elisabeth?
Thank you, Mabel, and thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm going to share my screen because I do have a presentation, which is mostly really photographs, but to sort of match with my talk today. So this really begins with a question. Mabel has introduced the talk, which is titled Impossible Pluralism, Religious Minorities, Migrants and Unsettled European Democracy. And the question that I want to focus on, and many questions nested within this broader question, is whether plurality is really possible in Europe, or whether Europe is simply a site of impossible pluralism. So this is actually the question that drove my engagement in the sociology department and in my first, I would say, European studies research at Cornell 20 years ago, which is terrifying, leading me to work on questions of inclusion and belonging since, both in academic work and in more policy and public writing, as Mabel recently or just told you. So nested within this initial question that is the title of my talk are other questions that continue to inform my work until today, and that I will talk through today by discussing my book and also newer research that connects to it. Who belongs and who is cast out of Europe? How do ethnic, religious, and racialized distinctions create imagined or cultural borders within and to Europe, in spite of certain legal inclusions, such as citizenship or other legal recognition of migrants and minorities? I will begin this talk by sort of introducing you to two images that you might already be familiar with. But these frame my broader discussion, so bear with me for a moment. The first image comes from the Brexit campaign. This image was used preceding the Brexit vote in 2016, where the Leave contingent, those arguing that the UK should leave the European Union, sort of put this image everywhere. It was on the internet, it was shared, it was on posters in London. I was actually there at the time. And on this, it says breaking point. The EU has failed us all. And what you see are Syrian refugees. And below it, what you see are the words, although it's partially blocked, we must break free of the EU and take control of our borders. Now, what's interesting here is one thing, this actually isn't an image from the UK or anywhere near to the UK. It's in fact an image from Slovenia. But what's interesting is the way in which migration and Muslims become sort of paired here. So in discussions about this image by Leave campaigners, they often used interchangeably the words refugees, migrants, and Muslims to describe who was in this image. Similarly, you see such a pairing here. Now, this image is from a protest of the Pegida Movement, which is a movement by the name of Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamicization of the West, which started in Germany and has grown over the last decade. Now, this protest in particular occurred following the major refugee migration to Germany and to Europe in 2015. So there were a set of protests led by the Pegida movement. And here you see things such as former Chancellor Merkel of Germany having been photoshopped with a headscarf on and the words, "Merkel, take your Muslims with you and get lost," or "Refugees, stay away, not welcome." Again, there was this equation, if you were reading the news, I don't know who else was reading the German news at the time, but there was this equation of physical attacks on quote unquote German women, or Bio-Deutsch, so bio, German women by Muslim refugees. And there was, again, this kind of language that collapsed Muslimness and migration status or refugee status into a category of otherness and a category of danger and threat. In fact, I interviewed some of these protesters in 2015 at such a protest in Berlin. And what happened was, when I asked why there was a protest specifically that was framed as an anti-immigration protest in the wake of this refugee migration, why there was such a protest being organized, they turned the questions on me. They asked me if I wanted Germany to become a Muslim nation state. "You don't want to wear a burqa, do you?" asked one of the organizers of the protest. So this collapsing of Muslimness and refugee or migrant status into this dangerous other, it is not a new trope. In fact, the image that you see now here is an image of the so-called Harkis. The Harkis were Algerian Muslims who fought to support the French colonial project. So essentially, they fought to maintain the French colonial project during the wars of liberation from colonialism. What happened was many then migrated to Paris and to France in order to escape their own persecution in Algeria in the 1960s. But in spite of their ultimate act of loyalty, that is, fighting to preserve the French colony, they were confined to so-called reception estates in France. And in 1962, Charles de Gaulle asserted of the Harkis, the term repatriates obviously does not apply to the Muslims. In their case, we're dealing only with refugees. So all three of these images and their twin discourses, all pairing the bodies of migrants or refugees and Muslims, show this similar grappling to protect European societies against certain forms of pluralism, which are seen as somehow a threat. If Muslims are migrants or refugees, they're outsiders. And if migrants are Muslims, they're seen as uncivil, somehow distinct from the rest of us. So now I will turn to my book, Mosques in the Metropolis, Incivility, Caste and Contention in Europe, to make sense of this collapsing of otherness and distinction in Europe into the figure of the Muslim in particular, and its intersections again and again with this idea of migration, refugee status, and being somehow seen as from outside of Europe. So you can see the image of my book cover here, and surrounding it other images from the same mosque, which is the Scheidlik Mosque in Berlin. Most of my research for this book took place from 2014 to 2017 in two of Europe's largest mosque communities. One is this mosque, the Scheidlik Mosque in Berlin, which is or was historically an ethnically Turkish mosque, built by those who migrated as guest workers to Turkey in the mid-20th century, from Turkey to Germany in the mid-20th century. The second mosque, the East London Mosque, which you see on the right-hand side of this image next to the Scheidlik Mosque, was historically a Bangladeshi and somewhat Pakistani community as well, but now also serves a growing Somali populace in East London. Those who migrated from Pakistan and what is today Bangladesh in the 1950s to 70s, so the same period, migrated as post-colonial migrants from the British colonial state. So these are very different mosques with very different histories. But something that I encountered in both and that I want to talk about today is this paradigm incivility that demarcates and constrains European Muslims' lives. Disputes over and even attacks on mosques have increased in recent years, specifically with the permanent settlement and citizenship of Muslim populaces who initially migrated again in the mid-20th century as either post-colonial migrants or guest workers to various European states. So there has been a lot of conflict over the place and visibility of mosques, which are seen as quote unquote fraught symbols and material centers for contention over if, when, and how Islam can be part of European public life. So for example, this idea of a quote unquote mega mosque as a symbol of Christian antagonism has stirred debate in the UK, France, and Germany. And what you see in the two images on the bottom of this slide are protests against quote unquote mega mosques in Germany, specifically against the Cologne Mosque, which you see on the top right of the slide, the one picture, actual photograph of a mosque, which is now the largest mosque in Germany. It was built in 2009. It began to be built and it caused a lot of debate, specifically because it was built, as you see, in a city with one of the largest cathedrals in Germany. And there was this discourse about how it was going to overshadow the cathedral, although it is not physically very close to it, and although it is much smaller. So it was more a debate really about the kind of cultural connotations of having a large mosque in a major German city. Now, on the top left-hand corner, the Stop Ja, this is an image from the campaign in Switzerland to outlaw minarets, which were in effect outlawed in 2009 through popular vote, as they were seen to represent political domination instead of religious domain. That was the language of basically this referendum that was brought and that was successfully passed in Switzerland. So here what it says is stop yes to the minaret ban. So as Muslim bodies as well, individual bodies and collective bodies, mosques in Europe are thus most significantly constrained by civility. It is these boundaries of civility rather than legal boundaries that lead to the ways in which mosques are seen and contended with. As sociologist Nick Howe writes, questions of sacred space are questions about whose feelings for a place count as civil, whose ways of seeing count as civil, and thus who is included in the cultural sphere of citizenship and civil belonging. Mosques elude civility in Europe, not only in their spatial structures, but also their purpose, with the social formation of the Muslim subject seen to clash with the socio-political formation of the modern European citizen vis-a-vis the secular state. As James Holston writes, quote, civility refers to the standards of behavior in common measure, to the etiquettes, manner, and virtues that make public life coherent and thus possible. Arguably shaped by both Islamic and European epistemologies, Muslims in Europe have come to signal ambiguity and incoherence. This civility-incivility divide that we see has created social hierarchies, specifically through resulting inegalitarian regimes of citizenship. And here I'm referencing not legal citizenship, but an idea of cultural citizenship, which is something that Jean Beeman, a sociologist at Santa Barbara, has written about extensively when she writes about the children of North African immigrants in France. What she shows is that regardless of economic status or legal status, there is a deep and enduring cultural hierarchy experienced by those that she terms citizen outsiders who cannot access full cultural citizenship, that are not seen as fully culturally belonging to the society at hand. So the research that I will discuss with you now is also with the children of immigrants, specifically Turkish German Berliners born in the German capital who are part of the Schädlich Mosque. The community as a whole, now in a mosque community you don't necessarily belong. We can speak about this perhaps in the discussion if wanted, but these are people who actively participate in the mosques, and many of the people that I'll speak about today are young leaders of the mosque. Yet the fact that they are German citizens does not release them from enduring cultural exclusions, is what we see here. Algerian French sociologist Abdelmalek Sayad, in fact, describes the children of immigrants as seen in their transcendence of the collapsing of Muslimness and migrant refugee status as, quote, the height of both civil and political impoliteness, and the height of rudeness and violence towards national understanding. The child of the immigrant suggests the stranger, in George Zimmel's terms, an insider, outsider who cannot be expelled. And the mosque now rises as the architectural embodiment of such strangers or strangerness, indelibly marking the European landscape. I will now tell you a bit about the experiences of some of the Şehitlik Mosque community members, second generation, again, Turkish Muslim Berliners born and raised in Berlin, and how associations with incivility affect their everyday lives. I'll focus on one of my interlocutors in particular, Yusuf, who is a law student and also a tour guide at the mosque. This mosque, in fact, gives daily tours to diverse groups of city dwellers like school children, retirees, parolees, etc. On an exceptionally bright afternoon in 2014, following one of the tours that he gave to the mosque, I met Yusuf by the gates to the street. He was running late for dinner and apologized and asked if we should return together on the bus that we both took back to Schöneberg, which is the district in which both of us reside. Well, he was born in Berlin. His parents and grandparents migrated to Germany vis-a-vis the guest worker program in the 1960s. And he himself had lived his whole life in Germany until he decided to study in the United States as an exchange student during law school. Between his anecdotes relaying the curiosities of everyday life in a new country, he injects larger lessons from his time away. Here, Yusuf draws this distinct line between American and German understandings of belonging. And this is the quote that I have here. He says to me, "One of the greatest experiences I had was in Louisville, when I met an African-American Muslim. He was the first I met there, and I thought he would be from West Africa, so an immigrant who came there to work. He was really traditionally dressed, like West African people, and I went to him and said, 'Salam alaikum.' He said, 'Alaikum salam.' And I asked, 'By the way, where are you from?' 'I'm from Louisville.' 'And where are your parents from?' 'From Louisville.' 'Their parents?' He said, 'Man, from Louisville.' 'And their parents?' 'Actually, they're from Alabama, but why are you asking questions like this?' Drawing on his previous experiences in Germany, Yusuf had equated Muslimness with foreignness, a sentiment and self-perception that this American Muslim did not share. Now he pauses and looks at me intently, gesturing a light bulb going off in his head. And so I was like, oh, it's possible. It's possible to have this connection and be American and be Muslim and as well. Germany is different. It hasn't gotten to that place yet, where being Muslim and being German can uncontestably belong together. Although born and raised in Berlin, Yusuf remains noticeably uncertain about how and if he belongs to Germany. He says there's something inherently unsettling about his Muslim identity to others who maintain that he's a guest or a foreigner. The word that is often used here in Germany is Ausländer, meaning foreigner, in the ways that they look at or speak to and struggle to characterize him. This all in spite of being a German national. He continues, who I am, it's a question I'm trying to cope with. When I was born, I had Turkish citizenship, but later on, when I was 16, I got the German one. So I had two citizenships. And when I was 18, I was forced to decide. It was really hard for me, but I'm someone who likes to travel, and I looked at the one I could travel the best with, the German one. For me, it doesn't mean anything to have a piece of paper in my hands. I had so many different experiences. I had times in my life when people came to me and told me that I should be quiet because I'm only a guest in this country and I have nothing to say. So society expects a lot from you, since according to them, you're not from the society, and it reflects in every aspect of your life. Sometimes I tell my mom, I don't even have a name. Yusuf is actually not the first or the last of those that I interviewed at the Şehitlik Mosque to equate German citizenship with a passport, an object representing to them not rootedness, but the capacity to cross borders, to move through the world. This sense of dislocation echoes in his statement that I don't even have a name, laying bare the space between full legal and cultural inclusion, even for individuals born and raised in Berlin. Now I will turn to an issue which I'm sure many of you have heard quite a bit about if you have followed anything about Muslim life in Europe, and something that came up in all of my conversations, including my conversations with Yusuf. And that is that struggles over Muslim belonging have come to center on a very particular embodied and gendered symbol or marker of Muslim life, and this is the headscarf. So both veiling, that is covering one's hair, and its counterpart, unveiling, emerged again and again and again in my research. The headscarf is not only the most regulated religious symbol in Europe, a point of obsession in the struggle over what and who can fully belong to contemporary European nation states, but also is kind of the most invoked symbol in conversations with my interlocutors about their life in Germany. Now here I'll talk briefly about the French case, and these are the photos you see, actually from the time of the so-called burkini ban, which I'll touch upon in a moment, in France. And the reason I want to talk about the French case is it's really in France that they set off these so-called headscarf debates about how and if and how the headscarf should be regulated in public or civic spaces. In his description of the unveiling of Muslim women in French Algeria in A Dying Colonialism, Frantz Fanon analyzes the veil as a universalized symbol of Islam, with its forced public removal in Algiers paradoxically justified as what he calls a civilizing act. And Joan Scott describes the politics of the veil today as continuing this civilizing process, the unenlightened Muslim juxtaposed to the enlightened European, with which Muslims have to contend. Yet even with the removal of the headscarf in compliance with the increasing bans on headscarves in French schools, which were again instigated by the so-called headscarf debates in the 1980s, the referent of incivility simply shifts to other embodied fragments. So for instance, in 2017, the long skirt of a schoolgirl named Sarah in Charleville-Mézières, France, was read as a quote unquote ostentatious Muslim signifier and led to her suspension. And few contemporary moments in Europe invoke this fixation on unveiling the Muslim body like the burkini bans that you see on this image in southern France, which lay bare the brute incivility of civilizing by force. Captured in this right-hand image of a woman with a headscarf on the beach of Nice, encircled by 3 police officers, removing her shirt under their collective gaze, is this kind of sense that there is forced civilizing mission that continues. As Tamia Feki, a French woman who wrote a letter to the New York Times, writes, I was curious to see if in the cities where they forbade women in burkinis, dogs could swim. The answer was yes for some of them. Dogs can actually have more rights than a scarfed woman. So some across politics argued in these kind of political and public conversations in French media, for instance, that such bans had become necessitated because of the growing Muslim populace following the 2015 refugee migration to Europe. So again, we're collapsing the idea that Muslims and migrants or refugees were a dangerous outsider group that had somehow made it within the society. While the headscarf bans that ensued in Germany differed from those in France, they came to regulate teachers rather than students in public schools primarily. They similarly centered again on regulating the Muslim body. In Germany, the bounds of such regulations were determined by the Federal Constitutional Court in 2 rulings in 2003 and 2015, but they're actually enacted at the federal state level rather than at the kind of overarching national level. So by 2003, half of the 16 federal states had bans on headscarves. Soon these were mostly amended to be bans on all religious symbols worn by teachers in public or state schools, given that signaling out the headscarf violated non-discrimination in the Constitution. However, in many of these cases, these expanded regulations excluded Christian symbols, deemed historical and cultural rather than religious. And in 2015, the language of threat itself came to characterize the Muslim body, with the Constitutional Court decision that such blanket bans violated the Constitution. So on the surface, this sounds good, right? This sounds like there is a space for more plurality. But what they actually ruled is that such bans could be upheld in cases when a teacher's donning of a religious symbol proved to be a quote unquote tangible danger to state neutrality or school peace. So on the surface, it appears to contend with discriminatory practices, but in fact, it reinforces this interpretive ambiguity of headscarf bans and the broader bifurcating discourse of Muslim quote unquote danger and mainstream civility in official state language. As we boarded the bus to Schöneberg on this day, Yusuf paints the picture of a woman on the street, her hand wrapped around an ice cream cone that's dripping on the ground. Or rather 2 women, one his mother and one me. In this powerful description of a potential encounter, he posits the different reactions that this scene would evoke, depending on the simple presence or absence of a headscarf. It's like, for example, when you would walk on the street and eat ice cream and drip on the ground, people wouldn't say anything. But if my mom would do that with her headscarf, people would say, "Don't you see what Muslims do?" So I will now turn to an instance of what Yusuf came to call, when he was giving me these different examples, "Don't you see what Muslims do?" This is on a broader scale in Germany. Muslims are today tellingly blamed for heightened anti-Semitic activity in Germany. So there has been a rise in anti-Semitism over the past decade or so. A 2014 op-ed that's published by one of Germany's foremost journalists, Joachim Bittner, in the New York Times, explains what's behind Germany's new anti-Semitism. This opinion piece equates acts of violence perpetrated by a small group of ethnically Arab youth to a Muslim problem, evidencing again this universalizing tendency to label uncivil sentiments and uncivil acts as quote unquote Muslim. Here again, anti-Semitism becomes attached to Muslims as quote unquote foreign, as immigrants, as it is described as a quote unquote imported sentiment or prejudice that migrates and migrated with refugees, specifically during the 2015 refugee crisis. The Central Council of Jews in Germany recently echoed a concern over this new form as emerging from within the Muslim populace, those who are in Germany but outside of its cultural borders, explaining that the whole society needs to take Muslim anti-Semitism very seriously. While a Bundestag report released in 2017 explained that right-wing extremists pose the most significant threat to Jews, accounting for over 95% of attacks, it also highlighted the quote unquote increased threat of Muslims in Germany without any kind of statistics or data to match. So these are various kind of images that relate to this relationality between Muslims and a quote unquote new anti-Semitism. Here it says in both German and English, "Protect Jews, stop Islamicization." There was an event held at the Jewish Museum in Berlin about imported anti-Semitism, manifestations, causes and manifestations of anti-Semitism among Muslims in Germany. And here's another article about a new German anti-Semitism rears its ugly head that focuses on hatred of Jews by some Muslim Germans. This false projection of a new anti-Semitism solely onto Muslims is not inane. So first, anti-Semitism in Germany is anything but new, and it's very much overall not imported, with most anti-Semitic discourses and almost all anti-Semitic acts emerging from a nationalist German right wing. Rather, this is a politically motivated portrayal of incivility. What is, after all, more uncivil in contemporary Germany than to persecute Jews? While polling, in fact, uncovers the linkages between anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim attitudes and acts across Europe, and again, their deep rootedness in right-wing movements, this mere popular sentiment that Muslims are to blame for this reinvigoration of anti-Semitism deepens associations of Muslims, and again, refugees, who are blamed for importing anti-Semitism from the Middle East with incivility. Here, Jews come to represent the perceived vulnerability of Europe juxtaposed against Muslims, rather than a vulnerable religious minority with a still uncertain place in Europe. Sometimes, as with the Pegida marchers, images of the stranger define exactly how a people does not want to see itself, as in the portrait in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, writes Richard Sennett. The image of the Muslim as anti-Semitism's new face in post-war Europe is very much akin to that portrait, exactly how Germany does not want to see itself. Now, in my book, I theorize how such extreme associations with incivility lead to what I term an undercast status for Muslims in Europe, their placement in a subordinated position within a culture-based hierarchy. We often talk about class in sociology, and I'm a sociologist, as a hierarchical social system, structure, or order. Now, class, as we know, and their resulting power arise out of unequal access to material resources and differentiated standards of living. Castes, on the other hand, are another form of social hierarchy, but they are a matter of ascription rather than achievement. As a sociological term, Max Weber operationalized caste not in the empirical plural, as how we often think of it today. For instance, India has multiple castes within its caste system, but rather the analytical singular, that is a position of extreme marginality that leads to stigma. So I invoke the concept of caste in the analytical singular, specifically that of undercaste, to make sense of the negatively differentiated Muslim status in contemporary Europe that is based in all of these associations with incivility. Enduring cultural distinction that fosters social marginalization has led numerous theorists to use caste as an analytical concept with salience across contexts. So I'm certainly not the first, nor do I think I'll be the last. Caste has been employed to understand the experience of Jews in Europe, as well as Black Americans. So today, probably most famously in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. Sociologist Herbert Gans coined the term undercaste in his early writings on urban inequality, and it's recently reemerged in the writings of Michelle Alexander on the positionality of Black Americans in the prison industrial complex today. Anyone economically or socially condemned to caste status will be viewed as different in skin color or religion, writes Gans. Culture, moral worth, or some other newly constructed characteristic can also be used to exclude people and place them in an undercaste. So I have built up this rather negative picture of what is going on in Europe, in the sense that Muslims writ large and many refugees and migrants who are coded as Muslim have been put into this extreme status of subordination that I term an undercaste. And yet, as in the last word or the last kind of piece of the trifecta of the second part of my book title, which is Incivility, Caste, and Contention in Europe, Muslims contend with this positionality and with this idea that they are somehow uncivil. So because of time, I'll point to one instance of such contestation, to this uncivil or undercaste status that my interlocutors at the Shatlik Mosque participated in, showing their agency in responding to marginality. And this is the transcendence of assumed Muslim anti-Semitism in deep Muslim-Jewish alliances in Berlin. So here the grounds of the city were used as a solidaristic opportunity to build relationships and support between Muslims and Jews. Many young Muslims at the Shatlik Mosque turn away from their primary identification with a nation state, whether in the case of Yusuf, for instance, Turkey or Germany, when he continuously asserts, I am a Muslim Berliner, and this is a Berliner mosque. This is, as he explains, because he recognizes the impossibility of belonging, but he feels that he belongs very much to Berlin. So the city becomes often, for my interlocutors, a place in which to make social and political demands for inclusion. And they do so through legal avenues, through education, activism, art, and even bids for political office. Now, one other way in which they do this is through alliances with the local Jewish community in the same neighborhood where the Shatlik Mosque stands. And this is the neighborhood of Neukölln, which is towards kind of the center east of the city, actually right where the wall used to stand. And an initiative that forms in this neighborhood and that has held many of the meetings, which you see on the left hand of the screen with these two women embracing in the Shatlik Mosque, so that's an image from the Shatlik Mosque, is the Salam Shalom initiative. In 2013, Armin Langer, a German-born Jewish Berliner who lives in the Neukölln neighborhood, started the Salam Shalom initiative in response to a Berlin rabbi named Daniel Alter. His claim that Neukölln and many parts of Berlin had become quote unquote no-go areas for Jews, made dangerous by a large Muslim and refugee populaces. In founding the Salam Shalom initiative, Langer wanted to demonstrate, to live and enliven the connection between Jews and Muslims in Berlin through what he terms multicultural cohesion, an alliance that not only respects but protects plurality on a local level. So this initiative arose amidst a social atmosphere of not only rising anti-Semitism, but also rising anti-Muslim sentiment, rising strength of right-wing movements, and even parties like the Alternative for Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany, which is now in the German parliament, and the rise of such movements like Pegida, contributing to the ambivalent relationships that both religious groups have with the German nation state. In the face of these national exclusions and othering, focusing on the Berlin metropolis and focusing together on making demands allowed them to renegotiate both selfhood and collective belonging. So one example, which you see on the right hand of this this screen is in 2015, a campaign called My Head, My Choice. And this is outside of Neukölln's City Hall, so the neighborhood City Hall. This campaign arose in response to the banning of religious symbols in civil service positions that focused mostly on Muslim women again. It emerged when Betul, who you actually see an image of here, she's one of the women embracing the one with the light colored long sweater, when she was denied a position in local government on account of her headscarf. So she was given a position actually in Neukölln City Hall on an interview that she had on the phone and based on her CV. And then when she came in and they saw that she wears a headscarf, they rescinded the offer. Young Muslim and Jewish women and men from the neighborhood got together to protest outside of City Hall. And even children were carrying signs with the words spoken in unison by their mothers, fathers, neighbors, friends that said, "My head, my choice," or slogans like, "It matters what's in a woman's head, not what's on it," printed beside sketches of women donning headscarves. Now, this campaign clearly used the language of liberal values, my body, my choice, articulating the headscarf as a matter of individual autonomy and freedom in the German city and state. And this led to a reinstatement of Betul's position in the end, which she declined. It also garnered global media attention, covered by major outlets across Europe and the US. Through contestation vis-a-vis the city of Berlin, Muslims and Jews together in the Salam Shalom initiative had transcended the incivility attached to the symbol of the headscarf and the incivility attached to quote unquote imported or new anti-Semitism that is projected onto Muslims in Germany and arguably in Europe now writ large. So now I want to just briefly, towards the end of this talk about whether there are possibilities for pluralism. And I argue that there are, if we are able to see through the stranger. And I mean this in two ways, in both senses of seeing through the stranger's gaze and seeing beyond the idea that there are strangers among us, those who are both inside and outside of our society. As Benjamin Pollock writes, the quote unquote stranger is the mediating concept of Europe. So again, when I'm using this term stranger, I'm referencing the work of Georg Simmel, who theorized the stranger as someone who is at once inside and outside of society, who is never fully belonging and yet always with and among us. As Simmel asserts in his foundational writing, the history of the European Jews offers a classical example of the stranger. This notion later is echoed by another sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, who theorizes this conceptual Jew, who he terms the prototypical ethnic, religious, cultural stranger. Muslims similarly are seen as ethnic, religious, cultural strangers forged by European society today. Yet I hope I pointed out through the case of Salam Shalom that agency exists even within such constraints, even in the context of today's unsettled and unsettling European democracies. There is also a thread of continuity in the story I've told. This assumed incivility that arose in relation to failed colonial and imperial endeavors that attached to the bodies of migrants who made their way to Europe and resettled, as well as their kin, their children, and their grandchildren today. At the same time, this incivility is now associated with new refugees, such as those who came in the 2015 refugee migration, specifically those from the Middle East, who are all collapsed into this other category of the Muslim. Now, I would like to end with a sort of very brief introduction to my more optimistic new project that posits Muslims and Jews as those that I term invisible architects of Europe. This is my Freigeist project. As there is a unique perspective endowed by being strangers in this way, as being both inside and outside of any society. So as Zygmunt Bauman also wrote, Jews were always on the outside, even when inside, examining the familiar as if it was a foreign object of study, asking questions no one else asked, questioning the unquestionable, and challenging the unchallengeable. Now, scholar of Islamic thought Ibrahim Musa similarly has written about how that experience of strangeness that European Muslims are experiencing today allows one to see things, to view things in a way that a domesticated or a complacent gaze may fail to observe. We must look to these critical perspectives of strangers in Europe, whether Muslim, Jewish, migrant, refugee, themselves, until essentially they're strangers no more, making space for their narratives and contributions to Europe its layered geographies, and its many imaginaries. This, I believe, is the first step towards a pluralism that rises from the lived level. For instance, the level of the metropolis, where initiatives like Salam Shalom take place, to the self-understanding of national societies. Building a truly plural present means pluralizing the collective memory that sets the foundation of who we are, incorporating the experiences of so-called strangers such that they are no longer strange, but familiar, that sees the children of immigrants not as the ultimate embodiment of incivility, but rather part of a shared present built on intersecting, overlapping paths and a shared future to come. So I will leave us with one example of this, or hope. In the early 2000s, Hadija Kemum, Zahia Rahmani, Dalila Kershush, and Fatima Besnachi Lanku wrote texts situating the individual memories of their fathers, the so-called Harkis, who I began this talk with, so Muslim Algerians who had fought to maintain the French colonial project. Before then, knowledge of the Harkis had remained largely relegated to family and personal histories. A private and painful intergenerational reckoning with the dual rejection of the Harkis as traitors by Algeria and as so-called refugees who are kept in what are now termed concentration camps and as Muslims by France. Through these written acts of unsilencing personal histories, their daughters expose the discrimination and the scapegoating that were at the heart of the Harkis' experience. And the memories of these quote unquote others came to infuse French collective memory. Controversial, political, and also deeply historicized, what was long an identity imbued with shame became contextualized in the larger French national and colonial project by writers who are seen as quote unquote from below. So today, Harki Remembrance Day is a national commemorative holiday in France. I will stop here.
Hello, everyone. All right, I'll ask the first question. And this is from someone who had the opportunity to work in Kosovo back in 2005. Let's see, as a cultural heritage advisor. And he's talking about how placing the biggest roadblock for Kosovo's independence, the World Heritage Convention put some cultural heritage, made cultural heritage political, basically. Since then, the two communities, Muslim and Christian, were given additional motives for permanent unrest. And the question is, to what extent the international community has contributed to limbos like the ones present in the Balkans. Trying to deliver a model democracy that clearly the question says is far from one size fits all.
I mean, that's a great and huge question that I think is coming from someone I know. So yes, I think that is one issue with democracy, right? If you look at you have to look at the very local experiences and then connect them to what a national or a nation state model will look like in that context. You can't apply, let's say the US, although the US likes to do this sort of model of democracy in other contexts. And I think in the case of the Balkans, the problem is that these ethnic and religious differences were used for political power and gain and created cleavages that hadn't always been there, but it was so extreme in terms of persecution and murder that there are cleavages that can't simply be healed. And so I think, although Kosovo did gain independence, the cleavages there between the Muslim and Christian communities are extreme to this day, from what I know. And I don't think that the kind of democratic model that you're going to have in Kosovo is going to look like any other place in Europe, for instance. The Balkans is also very special, and often when I'm talking about Muslims in Europe, I don't talk about the Balkans, but that is kind of the natural spring of Muslims in Europe. There is a native European, if you want to put it that way, large Muslim populace that has always been part of Europe since Europe existed as Europe, and becomes overlooked because of this predominance of thinking about Europe as a Christian, or imagined as a Christian place.
We have 4 questions. So we're getting a lot of questions. Let me try to do 3 of them so you can sort of bracket them. One of them is about what happens when Westerners convert to Islam, and what happens to immigrant Muslims then. And apparently there is England has a homegrown British Muslim presence. So that's the first question. They kind of group together. Germany, how do Muslims equate, I guess, Ummah with the nation of Germany? And again, Bosnian Muslims, how do they fit in? Because how did they relate to that in Bosnia? And then there's also a question which leads in a totally other direction, a very important direction, about how does this relate? Can you draw comparisons about what's happening in Europe and what's happening in India today? But I think the first two are probably enough at the moment for you to take on. So why don't you try those to start?
So
we'll save the questions. We can save the questions and we can send them to you, and you can also engage with the questioners if you want. Okay.
I do think the conversion situation is very interesting in Europe. There has been a lot of work done on Britain and also Germany. I didn't talk about the second mosque community that I did research in, but that had a very large convert population, and that's where a lot of my research ended up taking place with this group of converts. And what you see are, it's a very complicated picture, so I can't summarize it all. I think in the British case, it's very different from the German case, but what you see is actually a lot of people in Germany being seen as sort of traitors to German society. They end up on a lot of security lists. They're seen as sort of hyper-securitized because they've chosen into this stigmatized identity in a really interesting way. So being Muslim itself is highly problematized, even if you're a white German. In the UK, I think it is a bit more complicated. I think the management of religion is less fierce than in Germany, and certainly less than France. But I think that conversion creates your visibility. There is this wonderful anthropologist at NYU named Elaine Oliphant, and she always talks about the kind of hyper visibility of Muslims and also the mundaneness of Christian and Catholic symbols in Europe, specifically in France. So she uses this great image of a woman wearing, a nun wearing a habit, walking down the street next to a Muslim woman wearing a niqab, so a sort of full black cloak. From behind, you can't tell them apart. From the front, obviously they look a little bit different. But she says one you wouldn't even notice on the street. And I think this is what happens when people convert. They become much more visible to society and not necessarily positively visible, except, as in the case of the East London Mosque, many of the women that I worked with who did convert felt that they had gained a community in the Muslim community of East London. They had grown up economically struggling, often in difficult social and familial situations in East London, feeling isolated in an area that became increasingly inhabited by Bangladeshi migrants and their children. And they felt that by converting, they actually created a social and cultural community for themselves. So it's not all kind of in one direction of experience. Oh, and sorry, I skipped the second one. Yeah, so it depends a lot, again, where you are. So what I saw happen, and I touched upon it a bit today, was in Berlin was this kind of movement in this community towards feeling yourself as part of the city of Berlin, a sort of hyper-localized identification and way of being Muslim and being a Berliner and not having to think about these kind of associations or identifications with the nation state, because many of my interlocutors felt that they weren't really accepted by the nation state, not in Germany, not in Turkey, and they somehow straddled both and stood in between them. Whereas being part of Berlin was this more open identity, especially Berlin. I mean, Berlin is still being rebuilt in many ways. And it's a place in which they felt they could contribute to this kind of unifying force and creative force of the city. Now in London, my interlocutors at the East London Mosque, well, they really focus outwards. They also didn't focus on the nation state, but they focused on being part of the Ummah. The city was somewhat irrelevant to them, as was the nation state. It was more about how to be the best Muslim they could be in a Muslim community. And so their focus was on the Muslim collectivity, both locally and internationally. So again, it's very even difficult in the context of Europe, like in the context of these two global European cities. to come to some kind of a conclusion. Bosnian Muslims are it's an interesting, because these are Muslim Europeans who for all of kind of European history have been Muslim European or European Muslims, and are often left out of the picture because Europe's own picture of itself is one of a kind of Christian identity with Muslims coming from the outside. And so I think when you start talking about the Balkans, it unsettles that binary that of course is not real, but that dominates the imaginary of what Europe is culturally.
Patricia, you'll have to take over I have 36 seconds before I evaporate, they tell me.
Okay,
So.
no problem. All right, we've got a question here that asks, what do you think is the reaction of Christian Europe? What do you think the reaction of Christian Europe would be generally to religious minorities if Christian Europeans were generally more religious and less secular?
That's an interesting question. I think that I don't know how secular Europeans really are. I think there is some truth to this idea that religion, right, religious practices, kind of church going, these numbers have gone down. But in terms of like, what do we mean by religious? In terms of the kind of religious references, the partaking in religious holidays, the expectation that certain religious values and understandings are passed down to the next generation, those things are very present in Europe. I would actually say the presence of Christian holidays, at least I'm in southern Germany now, which is Catholic, is much more present than where I grew up in New York City, where Christmas is present, but the religious kind of connotations below it, knowledge of Advent, knowledge of topics that I was not brought up, kind of exposed to myself, is popular knowledge here. And so I think there is a sort of false dichotomy between the secular Europe and religion in general. And I think that there is kind of more diversity also, not just in nation states, but regionally. Again, from my experience living in Berlin versus living in Heidelberg, it's been very different. In Berlin, it looks a lot more to me like New York, whereas in southern Germany, you know, it's much more present, these kind of religious holidays and observances. Yeah, I'll stop talking now.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question. It's a little bit longer, so maybe need it. What is your opinion about some European politicians, such as in France, parsing out Muslim into allegedly European and allegedly non-European Muslims, such as Sarkozy's warm words about Albania, contrasted with his and others' negative views on Turkey? I'm curious about the way in which modern politicians mindfully or inadvertently reinscribe Orientalist binaries, while also denying it by posturing at a kind of new radical inclusion of indigenous Muslim communities in Southeast Europe in the context of EU, NATO, and other international organizations.
I mean, it's a great question because there's so much to say about this, but there is this kind of division happening at the moment in France. There is this new council of French Muslims being formed, and certain groups are sort of handpicked and represented in what is understood as French Muslim life, right? They will be the representatives of French Islam and French Muslims, and other groups specifically are left out. Many are left out, maybe not on purpose, but some on purpose, of course. So there is this attempt to form, there is on the one hand, what has been mentioned in this question, which is saying, well, certain forms of Islam that exist are more European or compatible with Europe. There's at the same time an attempt to form and inform what European Islam will look like, what French Islam will look like, or Germany, we have these schools of Islamic theology, which the government funded with the desire to create a certain form of Islam, desire to train the next generations of German imams.
Don't go away. Okay. Don't go away.
Is not what has happened. In fact, what they did was train academics who are academics and, you know, write about philosophy and theology. But there is this kind of desire to somehow create good forms of Islam, which are seen to be more European. And I think Balkan Muslims are often held up to be this kind of ideal romanticize that they're more multicultural, that they're more open, that they don't cover their hair, that there are many stereotypes and there are many kind of things that inform these perspectives where certain groups of Muslims become seen as the kind of bad Muslims and some as the good Muslims. But even being a good Muslim is not a guaranteed position. The Sheikh Mosque was seen as a good mosque for a long time and then quickly became a bad mosque when Turkish politics shifted. And so I think it's also a false idea that you can have kind of this general perspective of Muslims and have any kind of real belonging for some without real belonging for everyone.
So, and I believe this is a question. Yes. The previous one. Women often display their other stranger origins in their dress far more than men, such as the hijab. How much prejudice is expressed more towards women than men in your European experience?
I think both experience prejudice in very different, well, sometimes in the same ways and sometimes in different ways. Women, of course, wear the headscarf. The headscarf, not all women, but many Muslim women wear a headscarf. And it is really the most regulated symbol in Europe, across Europe. And so this kind of fixation, I think, makes it particularly difficult to be a woman who wears a headscarf, not just because, for instance, you couldn't be a school teacher in some places in Germany, but also because in your daily encounters, people assume that you're somehow subordinated, that you're being oppressed, that you have male relatives who are forcing you to wear the headscarf, that you don't have autonomy and agency. So all of these associations with the headscarf. However, I think that men also experience a great deal of discrimination. There is a great book on Muslim men in Berlin, written by Catherine Pratt Ewing from Columbia University. And what she captures in this really well is this idea of Muslim men as sort of as aggressors, as sexual aggressors, as violent. And so this association with the Muslim man and the vision of the Muslim man, who in Germany is the Turkish man predominantly, being someone who is violent, who will commit crimes, who will attack women is really the largest trope, and also seduce women. These tropes often remind me of the tropes that we see in the United States regarding Black men. There are a lot of similarities in the creation of this kind of violent of boys who are not only told from a young age that they have the potential of becoming this violent other by mainstream society, but you see the same reflections in things like the percentages of men in prison in France, for instance, and across Europe and the UK as well, being predominantly Muslim. So you see this kind of racial ethnic profiling, and you see this portrayal, of men as criminals and as dangerous, particularly to women, and then women as vulnerable, oppressed, and only sort of able to escape that oppression if they aren't, quote unquote, Muslim first, which is this language used often in both the UK and Germany, that if you're first German or first British or first French, especially French, I have to say, then it's okay to be kind of secondarily Muslim. But if you are secondarily Muslim, you might still drink alcohol, and you definitely won't wear a headscarf, and you'll probably eat pork, and you'll kind of violate all of these religious tenets to show your loyalty to something else, to the European secular notion first. And so I think that's shared between men and women.
We have, we have another question I wanted to ask a question, but I see we have a question on police treatment and brutality vis-a-vis Muslim men and incarceration rates. And that seems to me something with American echoes. Would you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, the rates, well, especially in France and the UK, Germany as well, but France and the UK are very high. It echoes of the US. I mean, I don't remember the exact percentages, which I have in a footnote somewhere in the book, but it's like 50 or 70%. And the rates of like how quickly these rates are growing so that they become really more and more dominated by the jails or the prisons by Muslim men is really incredible in both France and the UK. There is police brutality, certainly. There is profiling that we know in Germany, for instance. I interviewed police who worked for supposedly the most kind of multicultural, open, collaborative policing unit in Berlin. And when I met with them, I didn't talk about this today, but it was pretty horrible, some of the things that they said. For instance, they would go into schools when teachers would tell them, well, a young boy is coming to my class now and he's carrying a Quran with him. Or one young boy, and they were really proud of this, was wearing a prayer cap to school. And they said, well, we talked him out of it because although he's allowed to wear the prayer cap, it was making the teacher nervous because it means things could be going in some direction. And we know what direction that is. And so we convinced him using verses from the Quran by talking about how you take off your shoes in the mosque out of respect to take off his prayer cap in school. And we were so proud of ourselves that we convinced him this and we kind of maintained school peace. These kind of instances, although these are not, moments of violence in the way of some of more brutal policies or brutal experiences, but these are the kind of daily instances that I think give you an overview of what it's like, especially in schools, because most of this happens in schools. Teachers in most of in the UK and Germany have been tasked with identifying potential radicalization, whatever this means. So usually it means someone starts wearing a headscarf or more conservatively dressing, a woman or a boy, it's usually targeting boys though, carries a religious symbol, starts praying or asking for a space to pray in school. Then they go to their parents and they have talks, etc. But that police intervention happens at a really young age. And these kind of encounters with the police also in public life, which I do think echoes and reflects what happens in the United States, that from being boys into men, you're targeted. So it's unsurprising that there are higher rates of incarceration.
I was wondering, we have about 5 minutes left, and this is kind of a big question, but one of the things that I'm observing across Europe is that there seems to be almost a flattening of electoral politics. In other words, the German elections was kind of like, it's hard to really describe what happened in the German elections, except that the AfD did really well in the former Eastern Europe. But then in this kind of, and we'll see what happens in France next month, or in 2 months actually, but along with this flattening, there seems to be an intensification, or this institutional flattening, and I'm sure people would disagree with me over that. But at any rate, if you agree or disagree, there seems to be an acceleration of more extremist behavior at the fringes in public spaces. And I saw some of that in your talk also, or extra parliamentary taking over of things that aren't being satisfied with the government. Do you have any thoughts on that, about the relationship between some of these groups and movements that you've described on both ends of the political spectrum and the electoral politics in Germany or wherever, actually?
I mean, I do think that is in the case of Germany. In Germany, the rise, I didn't talk much about it, but the rise of the AfD, which is the alternative for Germany, is shocking given the political history. Various sort of chapters or local political organizations that are pieces of the AfD, basically in local AfD chapters, I don't know what to call them, they are under watch by the government because they're on this fringe where they are still part of the parliamentary system and they're actually a growing presence in the parliamentary system, but they also capture this very, very right-wing, some leaning towards violence, some leaning towards sort of neo-Nazism, which in the German case is pretty terrifying. And the percentages, this is what I always think, I mean, they're not low. You're not looking at 5%, you're looking at 20%, 15, 20%. In some regions, much higher.
Some regions,
some regions are really high. And so I think that there is this sense that there is once this sense within politics, but then there is also this sense that politics can't take care of the problem. And I think that's what Pegida rose out of. And these kind of local, again, these local chapters, instantiations of the same kind of sense that the government can't actually provide for you, that you're left out. I think it is this story of globalization. I think it is this story in Germany, especially in the East, that the kind of East got left behind, and that there's a focus on integration of migrants, but there's no focus on the fact that unemployment rates in the East are extremely high, that there is like flight from all of these cities and towns. and this kind of enduring inequality between the East and West of Germany. So in Germany, it's mostly in the East that you get this really rise in right-wing sentiments. And then for me, perhaps the most frightening is the sort of infiltration of the police and these have been scandals in Germany, the police and the military by sort of like neo-Nazis, and not just a couple of neo-Nazis, but really like organized neo-Nazis. Yeah, so I think there is a huge right wing, and there is, of course, Germany always has a left wing. The left wing doesn't seem to be gaining much power.
Yeah, no, left wing is not doing too well across Europe, at least if you think of the traditional left wing. You only have one last question that I'm going to. I know this person was one of your former teachers here and desperately wanted to come to your talk, so I want to give him the last question. Muslim Germans' attitudes and concrete gestures of aid to Rohingya populations in Bangladesh and in Myanmar compared in strength and duration to Christian, secular, and Jewish Germans' attitudes and gestures of aid. I see that more as a comment than a question, but I guess, do you have anything to say about that comparison?
So the comparison to
aid that was given Christian, secular, and Jewish Germans' attitudes. And in other words, I guess what the question is saying, that Christian, secular, and Jewish Germans had more openness to giving aid to the Rohingya populations in Bangladesh and Myanmar than the Muslim Germans. I think that's what I'm.
That is possible. The aid, that's an interesting topic in and of itself, the kind of aid and connection to global movements. And because in the German case, I do think a lot of the connectivity is made to Turkey, not always, but often. So in terms of giving aid or international support, it often is focused on Turkey or that region. Palestine as well is just, and then I think, yeah, so I think it's not necessarily all persecuted Muslims, but I do think those who experience persecution in the UK, in the mosque that I was researching, they always were whatever kind of the latest humanitarian crisis in the Muslim world or against Muslims was the focus of all of their giving. And so it also depends a bit on the kind of national structure and the structure of the community, whether the community is still somewhat of an ethnic community focused on its kind of ancestral history and connections, or whether it's like the community at the East London Mosque, which sees itself very much as a sort of global Muslim community.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and thank you so much for joining us today and for this very interesting and stimulating discussion of an ongoing issue, certainly an ongoing issue on the European continent. And we'll see how it all, well, there is no end of history, so things will change over time. So again, thank you to our audience for sticking with us through all the time. And I see somebody, brilliant analysis of a complex situation, one of your anonymous questions in the commentators, and I think that's a good place to end. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our audience, and join us again for our next talk in 2 weeks on fascism and the return of fascism. This is not a happy series, but we're hopeful. We're hopeful. So again, thank you, Elisabeth.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.